informal session to order. And I believe the first item on the agenda today is the disparity study consultant feedback. And Taylor Adams is here and is going to make the introductions.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor and Vice Mayor, Council, Mr. Hanson and Stiles. So happy to be with you all this afternoon. You'll remember it was a year ago, give or take at the end of September to be exact, that we contracted with BBC Research and Consulting out of Denver, Colorado to conduct the city's first disparity study. BBC has done a wonderful job of collecting our data, engaging the public, doing a series of focused vendor interviews, and then also conducting some pretty thorough analysis, and they're here today to present their findings, their draft findings ahead of submission of the report in a couple of weeks. Before I get out of the way and just say Samir Bawa has been, and Iris McClish now. She's gotten married while we were doing the study, and her name changed. But Samir and Iris have been wonderful to work for. It's been a great partnership, and we're delighted that they're here today. One thing to mention before I step aside and hand it over to Samir, you all will remember we made a commitment to ensure that everyone was receiving the results of the study at the same time. So we'll apologize for being outside of protocol just a little bit. A copy of there was an abbreviated version of Samir's presentation that was that was in your council package. We now have, as you can see, Samir brought the full presentation with him, and we're distributing that to you now, just so that, again, we can be true to our commitment to you and to the community. There are 21 copies here, so there won't be quite enough to get to everyone in the room, but should be enough for you and some people. With that, I'll get out of the way. Samir.
Thanks, Taylor.
Welcome, Samir.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I don't think I've ever been in front of these many cameras, but who said economic research wasn't glamorous? I want to start, of course, just by thanking Taylor's office. As Taylor said, it's been a monumental effort for the last 12 months, and that wouldn't be possible with all the help we got from them in collecting data on their contracts, the vendors that work for them, so forth and so on, helping just facilitate this process. I also would be remiss if I didn't thank Delcino Miles, who from the Miles Agency, who worked on our study team. Delcino was just a great local partner to have. We're so happy we found her, and just a pleasure to work with. So I wanted to thank her as well. So in the presentation today, I am going to review the research that we've conducted over the last 12 months and then present results from some of our core analyses. So I want to begin just by quickly going over the objectives of the disparity study. The core answer that we were assessing as part of the process was, do minority and women-owned businesses, what I often refer to as M's and W's, face barriers as part of the city's contracting processes? Excuse me. One way that the study assesses that question, really at its core, is to assess the degree to which minority and women-owned businesses actually participate in city contracts relative to their availability for that work. And I'll unpack those terms in just a couple of minutes. We also, as part of the study, assessed marketplace conditions here in the Virginia Beach region for minorities, women, and minority and women-owned businesses to assess whether they face barriers in areas like access to capital, access to bonding and insurance, business ownership, business success, and things of that nature. The study also provided a comprehensive review of the contracting policies and programs that the city has in place to help them identify any policies that might be inadvertently making it more difficult for small businesses and minority and women-owned businesses to actually do work with the city. And then finally, we also provide a number of considerations that the city can make moving forward to help further encourage participation of small businesses and minority and women-owned businesses in their contracting. In order to, before I get to that, all of this is in order to make the city's SWAM program more effective, of course, in encouraging minority and women-owned business participation, but it's also to help ensure that all the decisions they make now and moving forward are in compliance with federal regulations, state and local regulations, and relevant case law. Part of that is making sure that the programs the city has in place meets the strict scrutiny standard of constitutional review, which means that the city has evidence that there's a compelling governmental interest for them to address barriers that minorities and women and minority and women-owned businesses might be facing, and also that any measures that they choose to use in the future are narrowly tailored to those groups for which there's evidence that are actually suffering barriers. And then also making sure that their program and the decisions they make are consistent with relevant case law around minority and women-owned business programs. In order to do that, the disparity study was made up of a large collection of both quantitative and qualitative research tasks. And today I'm going to focus in on results from the core of those tasks. So the utilization analysis, which measures the dollars that actually went to minority and women-owned businesses during our study period. The availability analysis, which provides an estimate of the dollars we would expect minority and women-owned businesses to receive based on their existence in the marketplace, the types of work that they conduct, the size of contracts they can work on, so forth and so on. And then the disparity analysis, which assesses whether there's any differences between actual participation and availability to assess whether minority and women-owned businesses are being underutilized on city work. So we'll begin with the utilization analysis, which again is designed to calculate the percentage of dollars that actually go to minority and women-owned businesses on city work. So as part of that process, we gathered data both from the city as well as primary research that we conducted in the form of surveys with vendors that actually worked on those contracts. So in terms of city data, we work closely with the procurement office and Taylor's team to collect information on all of the contracts that the city awarded during our study period, which was July 1st, 2012 through June 30th, 2017. We collected contracts in construction, architecture and engineering, other professional services, and goods and supplies. And that includes both prime contracts as well as subcontract information that we collected in many cases directly from prime contractors who performed the work. Once we compiled all of that information, we then went out in the field and collected information through surveys and other sources on two key pieces of information. So for every vendor that participated in those contracts, we wanted to determine their primary line of work, as well as the race, ethnicity, and gender of their owners. Now, it's important to note that when I show results for participation, for availability, for disparities, that includes all minority and women-owned businesses, regardless of whether they're actually certified as SWAM businesses, as DDEs with VDOT, or through any other certification program. So this is based on the race, ethnicity, and gender of the owners, independent of any certifications. So, as far as the participation results, in total we looked at $1.2 billion of city contracting over that 5-year study period. And what our analysis showed is that minority and women-owned businesses received about $222 million of those dollars, or 18.9% of the city's dollars during that time period. The plurality of those dollars went to non-Hispanic white woman-owned businesses. So about 8.2% of that 18.9% went to non-Hispanic white women. And then the largest racial groups that received dollars with the city were Asian American-owned businesses at 5.6% and Black American-owned businesses at 4.5%. Another note here, when I talk about woman-owned businesses, I'm talking specifically about non-Hispanic white woman-owned businesses. If there are businesses owned by minority women, those businesses were classified along with their corresponding racial ethnic group. So for example, any dollars we showed for Black American woman-owned businesses would show up in the line for Black American-owned businesses considered together. So of course it's useful to know the percentage of dollars that are going to minority and women-owned businesses. So knowing X amount of dollars went to Black American-owned businesses or white women-owned businesses is useful, but it becomes even more instructive if you have a benchmark to compare it against. That is, how many dollars should minority and women-owned businesses be receiving from the city based on their availability for that work? So if you consider their existence in the marketplace, the types of contracts they work on, their interest in working for the city, the size of contracts that they can compete for, what percentage of the city's dollars would you expect to be going to those firms? And that was the primary objective of our availability analysis. So our objective for the analysis was to represent the entire business population that does work relevant to city contracts, both prime contracts and subcontracts, and that have a location within the Virginia Beach region. So that's Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Norfolk, and Portsmouth. So if they had a location in one of those four, I know you guys don't have quite have counties, but in those four areas, and you do work that the city actually contracts for, we wanted to represent you as part of our availability analysis. But the idea of the availability analysis is not to conduct a survey or to collect information from each and every business out there, but rather conduct our survey in a way that allows businesses an unbiased and equal opportunity to participate in our survey process, so that what results is a database that represents that entire business population, so that those who complete the survey are representative and look like the larger business population, and then we can say something statistically valid about what the marketplace looks like. So in order to do that, we started the process by establishing what we call, oh, there it goes, a phone book. So we looked at national business listings, augmented it with the city's bidders list and other information, so that we had a listing of businesses whose lines of work were relevant to what the city contracts for, and that were actually located within the relevant geographic market area. So then we went through and called each and every one of those businesses up to 5 different times over the course of 2 weeks to ask them to participate in what we call an availability telephone survey with us. As part of that survey, we asked them about their primary lines of work, their roles in which they work, so do they work on prime contracts, subcontracts, or both, the year in which they were established, as well as whether they actually serve customers here in Virginia Beach, their capacity to actually work on city prime contracts and subcontracts, so what's the largest contract that they've ever bid on or been awarded in the past, their interest in actually working for the city in the future, and then of course the race, ethnicity, and gender of their owners. Once we collected all that information, we developed what we call an availability database, and then we went through a contract by contract matching process, where we took the first contract in our analysis, looked at its characteristics, and figured out which firms in our database had characteristics that matched the characteristics of that contract. So if it was a prime contract worth $30 million in building construction, we would look for all the firms who do building construction work as prime contracts, and can bid on work or have bid on work or can do work of $30 million or more. We then repeated that process for every prime contract and subcontract in our analysis, aggregated all that information for an estimate of the percentage of dollars that would go to minority and women-owned businesses based on their availability. Does that all make sense? All right. So, going back to our circle of dollars, again, based on $1.2 billion of contracting, and after we went through that matching process, what our research shows is that the availability of minority and women-owned businesses for city work is 25.2%. In other words, for every dollar of contracting that the city awards, 25 cents, roughly 25 cents should be going to minority and women-owned businesses based on their existence in the marketplace and the characteristics of those firms. Here's how availability breaks down by individual groups. Again, much like availability, the highest availability that we saw was for non-Hispanic white woman-owned businesses. So the 25.2% availability, 13.2% was attributed to white woman-owned firms. Black American-owned businesses showed the highest availability among racial ethnic groups. So they showed an availability of 8.1%. Now, the exciting part comes, of course, in comparing participation to availability. So that is the primary objective of the disparity analysis, to assess whether for each relevant group and for different contract sets, there are any differences between actual participation and each group's availability for city work. So our calculation for that is relatively straightforward. So for a particular group, for a particular set of contracts, we took the dollars that that group actually received on city contracts and divided it by the dollars that our availability estimate suggested they would be available for. And that results in what's called a disparity index or a disparity ratio. So a disparity index of 1 indicates that participation and availability are largely in line with one another. A disparity index of less than 1 indicates a disparity. In other words, minority and woman-owned businesses are being underutilized on that set of city contracts. And a disparity index of 0.8 or less turns out to be legally important because that's what many courts use as a threshold to indicate substantial underutilization. And that's often used as what's called an inference of discrimination against the group. In other words, that group is facing barriers in the marketplace, and an organization like the City of Virginia Beach can use that as justification for stronger measures to help address any of those barriers. So looking at the results, so this is all contracts considered together, and you'll see each of the individual groups shown on that vertical axis. So we'll see all minority and women-owned businesses at the top, and then each individual racial group following that, and then non-Hispanic white women at the bottom there. We've drawn a line at 100. That's the line of parity. So again, that just means that participation is in line with availability. And then we drew a line at 80, which is that threshold for what's often considered a substantial disparity or substantial underutilization. So what the results suggest is that when you look at all minority and women-owned businesses considered together for all city contracts, there is a substantial disparity. So minority and women-owned businesses are receiving about 75 cents of every dollar you would expect them to receive based on their availability. And then the data below that show outcomes for individual groups. So Black American-owned businesses, Hispanic American-owned businesses, Native American-owned businesses, and non-Hispanic white woman-owned businesses are all substantially underutilized relative to each group's own availability. The only exception is Asian American-owned businesses, which showed a disparity index of more than 200. And there's an interesting note on Asian American-owned businesses. So in total, they received about $62 million in city contracting dollars over the course of the study period. 56 million of those dollars went to a single professional services firm. So it's not necessarily the case that Asian American-owned businesses are enjoying in that success equally, but the vast majority of those dollars went to a single firm. So one important, we look at all sorts of different contract sets as part of the disparity study, and when we submit a report, the city will have access to different breakdowns of the data. But one important breakdown that I wanted to highlight was the effectiveness of SWAM goals in encouraging the participation of minority and women-owned businesses in particular. So a little background. The city, for many of its contracts during the study period, applies what are called SWAM goals to those contracts. When they do so, prime contractors have to show good faith efforts to subcontract with SWAM certified businesses. So 50% of their subcontracting has to go to SWAM certified businesses. It's important to note that SWAM certified businesses aren't just minority and women-owned businesses, but many of those businesses are small businesses owned by non-Hispanic white men. So an important question is that program and is the use of those SWAM goals having an impact on minority and women-owned businesses in particular? So we looked at SWAM goals, outcomes for SWAM goals contracts versus contracts without goals to see if there was a difference in outcomes. So same setup as before. You'll see each of the individual groups on the vertical axis, a line drawn at parity at 100 and a line drawn at 80 to show that threshold for substantial disparities. And I'm going to show you goals contracts first. And what you see is that we're still seeing substantial underutilization for many of the individual groups. So Asian American owned businesses, Black American owned businesses, Hispanic American owned businesses, and Native American owned businesses all showed substantial disparities relative between participation and availability on contracts that the city awarded with the use of SWAM goals. The only exception was non-Hispanic white woman-owned businesses. So even though overall they show a substantial disparity, when goals are in place, that disparity to some degree is being addressed. It's above the line of being considered substantial, but there's still a disparity there. If you look at no goals contracts, you see that you still have substantial disparities for most groups. Again, Black American-owned businesses, Hispanic American-owned businesses, Native American-owned businesses, and now non-Hispanic white woman-owned businesses all show disparities without the use of SWAM goals. The exception is Asian American-owned businesses, and again, that happens to be the case that the one firm that received the majority of those dollars, they did so on contracts that did not include SWAM goals.
Oh, I just said it looks like we're doing better without goals than we did with.
Yeah, and
Did I read that right?
I would sort of, I guess I would, that might be too strong. What I would say is that it doesn't appear that the use of SWAM goals is making a marked difference in encouraging the participation of minority and woman-owned businesses specifically. That doesn't say anything about the effectiveness of, for example, encouraging the participation of small businesses in general, particularly non-Hispanic white men or white male-owned small businesses, because we don't have those data here. But when you look at just minority and woman-owned businesses and whether or not SWAM goals are in place, they don't seem to be, the outcomes don't seem to be that much better with or without SWAM goals.
All right, Jessica had a question here.
Yeah, of course.
When you did this part of the analysis, did you compare what our goals were relative to what other communities do? Because could it be that, yeah, we have goals in place, but perhaps our goals or how they're worked or used or, executed are not.
Yeah,
It could be vamped up. That could be the issue, not that they're.
Yeah, so I would say, so about 2/3 of the contracts that we looked at, if I'm remembering correctly, 2/3 of the contracting dollars had goals attached to them. Mm-hmm. It's a bit unique without attaching a value judgment to it. I think it's fair to say it's unique how the city applies those goals. So one aspect of it, of course, and this is often done, is that it's really a small business goals program, right? Because
Okay.
it's for all small businesses, not just minority and women-owned businesses in particular. The second part that might be unique is that 50% piece. The idea that the goals work so that 50% of your of a prime contractor subcontracting at the time of bid would go to SWAM certified businesses. The way we more typically see it is that even in a small business goal, a city or an organization might look at a contract and say, based on the availability in the marketplace, we think 15% of this contract should be going to small businesses in general. So there's aspects of it that are certainly unique. How that ties to their effectiveness, I can't say unequivocally, but certainly there are parts of it that are a departure from how other organizations we see implement similar programs.
Just a follow-up question, because you said at the time of bid. Does this measure what actually happened then?
This does not necessarily measure what actually happened. So for most of our contracts, we looked at what were the commitments at the time of the award. And the reason we do that, so there are pluses and minuses to looking at actual attainment at the time we pull data and looking at award data. The time of award has the advantage that it looks at every contract at the same point in time.
Right.
What did they say they were going to do when they won the award? Looking at actual expenditures gives you an idea, well, what actually happened today. The problem with it is that when we pull data, contracts are in different
Sure.
parts of their progression. So it could just be the case that we happen to be looking at a very large contract right when it started, and we're showing no minority and women-owned business participation. The downside of looking at awards, of course, is that things might change during the course of a contract. Minority and women-owned businesses might not be getting the contracting dollars they were promised. So we kind of weigh all of that and we aim for award because it gives us a consistent look at each contract at the same time. But of course, there's some of the contracting dollars we're looking at here that were also based on expenditures just because it was the best data that we had when we looked at the information.
Thank you.
Jim Wood.
So let me kind of go back to what Shannon was talking about, goals versus no goals, and I'm struggling with one thing because I took a note. When you were talking about the availability analysis, you indicated, and I think the phrase you said was race, ethnicity, or gender, no matter the certification.
That's right.
Okay, that's how you did the phone book study, or similar to that, where you're determining who was out there, and you weren't concerned with whether or not they had a SWAM certification or something like that.
Well, we had access to the certification data, obviously, but we used that as a way to confirm what people told us in surveys, but we did not limit our analyses to only those firms that are certified.
And so then that's where I'm trying to figure out this goals versus no goals, because, and Taylor can answer this, I guess, but under the city guidelines, you have to deal with, saying city made Siri come on, they have to be SWAM certified, correct?
So,
In
So,
other words,
yes,
if you're bidding on building a new police precinct, you've got to hire 15%, your goal is 15% of SWAM certified.
that's right. We do allow some self-certification within our system, but it's important to note our self-certification is only intended to initiate the process for achieving SWAM certification. SWAM certification can take a number of years to attain, and so we do some independent validation. But yes, that's but we assume a closing window in that self-certification period that our team monitors, whereby that business is working towards SWAM certification. If they don't achieve that within 3 years, they fall off. One thing to note here that might be helpful, just sort of in the way that we've historically presented information to you all. Remember, we only, up until 18 months ago, the SWAM specific requirement in subcontracting was only in our construction pool, where we have always struggled. So a lot of these, for example, the Asian American contract that Samir is mentioning, is out of our goods and services pool, where we have never had a SWAM requirement for subcontracting participation in particular. So it's important to note, we have, as you all have seen, we have always performed better in goods and services than we have performed in construction, and a lot of that is borne out here as well as it relates to the goals versus no goals piece.
John Moss.
I think it would be good to normalize that chart to show the differentiation, because I think that would be insightful.
By industry?
Yes, I think
Yeah.
that would be very insightful. On the slide 2, it's all about, and I realize this is not the final report, this is just the overlook on the statistical analysis, but I assume that the final report is going to talk about the question posed on slide 2, which is the barriers, the why between the availability number and the actual achievement, and there'll be some kind of causal analysis about what those barriers are and their contribution relative to the differentiation.
Yes, I mean, we're hesitant to make causal links because that's a tricky thing to do, but we spend a lot of time in our report and a lot of time in the past year assessing barriers that exist both within the city's contracting processes as well as in the marketplace as a whole that could be contributing to some of these barriers and provide some of that why. So what difficulties do small businesses, minority and women-owned businesses, and minorities and women face out in the marketplace that ultimately lead to outcomes with competing with city contracting?
Is it correct to conclude that the final report relative to the barriers that you just addressed will be in there? There will be a set of recommendations to mitigate those barriers?
Considerations that the city should take, yes.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
All right, here's what I got.
Please tell us.
Gary's got the answer.
Siri and I have a special relationship. I can turn on
Clearly.
Siri in any room I'm in.
Does age of the population have any bearing on this?
Can you talk more about that?
Well, we have, our population is starting to age, and it has been doing that for several years now. And my question is, if that segment of our population continues to do that, does that have any bearing upon what your study, the results of your study?
Yeah, I mean, it very well could. I don't know the answer. The only answer I could give is speculative at best. But I will say that minority and women-owned businesses in general tend to be younger than non-Hispanic white male-owned businesses. So to the extent that that maps to the age of business owners, and as the city gets younger and the next generation of business owners come into fruition and existence, that could impact availability such that you might see increasing availability among minority and women-owned businesses. But again, that's speculative. We haven't really looked at that relationship in particular. But if it's the case that demographics are changing among younger generations, then that relates probably pretty closely to business ownership as well.
Rosemary?
So, is part of our problem we're not getting enough SWAM companies to bid? Or is it that we're not choosing enough of the ones that are bidding?
Is that your next slide?
Or is it both?
Yeah, so it's probably some combination thereof, and the key is really figuring out if you have a number of minority and women-owned businesses that aren't bidding, why aren't they bidding? So we spent a good amount of time conducting interviews with Delcino's team to figure out what are some of the barriers you're facing with city contracting, what are some of the barriers you face out in the marketplace. And I can say at least what we've seen nationwide. I don't want to speak specifically to interview data for the city's disparity study, just because I don't have it at top of mind, is that often minority and women-owned businesses become discouraged with the process, either because it's really time-consuming, because requirements are difficult, and minority and women-owned businesses that tend to be small in nature, as well as newer in nature, just find parts of government contracting difficult to deal with. And I have some of those recommendations at a high level, much more in the final report, but part of the objective here is to understand why minority and women-owned businesses, if they are, would be turning away from city contracting, and what difficulties might exist for them and might exist for all small businesses that the city could easily address, or at least think about addressing moving forward.
I see you have some more slides, so are you going to move into them, or?
Yeah, I just got a couple more slides,
Okay.
actually. It's just really some high-level considerations that have come out so far in some of the analyses that we've conducted, both on the qualitative side as well as the quantitative side, and things that the city could think about as it's looking to further encourage participation of small businesses and minority and women-owned businesses. And I should say another objective of the study was to look at these outcomes for veteran-owned businesses as well. Just in the spirit of time, I didn't include that in the presentation today, but that's also going to be part of the draft report as well as our final report. One thing that came up a lot, and often comes up across the country where we work, is contract size. So many minority and women-owned businesses, as I mentioned, tend to be small in nature. And other small businesses brought this up as well, that the extent to which the city can make efforts to unbundle contract pieces in construction, primarily because that's where the largest contracts tend to be, but other contracting areas as well, is helpful to minority and women-owned businesses looking to compete for city work. So obviously, it's not always the case that unbundling one large contract piece into smaller contract pieces isn't always the most efficient thing to do, either from a internal resources perspective or a dollars perspective. But it is something that is helpful to minority and women-owned businesses and small businesses in general, because it allows them more contracting opportunities and things that they can look at when they see solicitations come out and at least consider competing for, because it's more in their wheelhouse and something that's more digestible to those small firms. Another issue that came up is this is probably the smaller of them, is a contract notification. Just making sure that there is information widely disseminated about contracting opportunities with the city, particularly when they are smaller in nature, because obviously the more small businesses that are aware of those opportunities, the more minority and women-owned businesses that are aware of those opportunities, that just increases competition among those groups for city contracting work. We also have considerations for stronger measures to help address some of the barriers and some of the disparities that we see in the disparity study. One of those are small business set-asides. Now, I've talked to Taylor. We've talked about efforts that the city could be making in the future around a sheltered business program. In other words, setting aside certain contracts of certain size for small business bidding. Again, with the idea that this isn't something that's based on race, ethnicity, and gender, but if you are holding contracts out just so that small businesses are bidding on them, that might go a long way in encouraging and achieving participation among veteran-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, and women-owned businesses in the area. And then the other consideration is to make something that's actually based in the race, ethnicity, and gender of the owners, race and gender conscious goals. So again, the SWAM goals program is something that's a small business goals program. But what many organizations do across the country is they will use race and gender-based goals on their contracts. So when a prime contractor is submitting a bid based on the availability of minority and women-owned businesses in the marketplace, an organization might set an X% goal that prime contractors have to either meet that goal by making subcontracting commitments to certified minority and women-owned businesses, or show good faith efforts that they tried to do so and for whatever reason failed to do so, that the city has to sign off on in order for their bid to be considered responsive. Again, that's not something that we're recommending that the city at least consider that, only because the data suggests that there are substantial disparities that exist for many groups, even while the city has been using relatively strong small business-based measures, but something for future thought as the city looks to strengthen its SWAM program in the future. And this is not to take away anything from, 18.9%, all that said, is nothing to sneeze at either. That is a substantial amount of dollars that are going to minority and women-owned businesses in the future. I think but there's also room for work. One issue with that is that, again, making sure that those dollars are going to a wide number of businesses instead of being concentrated in just with a couple of businesses. And as part of the program, there's still that disparity between actual participation and the availability of firms out there, and that's something to consider moving forward.
Shannon had a question.
In your experience throughout the country, when you've done these with other municipalities and looking at the disparity, it seems like Native American and Hispanic American were the largest disparity. In rectifying the problem, do municipalities tend to start with, say, the Native American, which were at the 2, or do they start there, or what do most municipalities do to correct this?
It's a little less nuanced than that, if that's possible, because the way disparity studies are often used by different municipalities is to narrowly tailor their programs to those businesses for which disparities exist, for which substantial disparities exist. So not necessarily aiming just at those businesses that show the largest disparities, but perhaps an approach to it is which business groups show disparities under that 80 threshold. That's why that 80 threshold is so important, because many courts see it as an inference of discrimination in the marketplace against those firms and can serve as a justification to include those business groups as part of, say, a race and gender-based goals program. So I haven't seen it where it's tailored to just the groups with the biggest disparities, but certainly in order to be considered narrowly tailored, perhaps limiting it to those groups for which substantial disparities appear, regardless of how substantial they are.
Jim Wood.
I had one question, but I kind of wanted to go back to what Shannon mentioned there again. What is the universe of the Native American availability? Is it,
Tiny.
okay, so if you've got one firm and that firm doesn't bid, then,
Yeah, it's probably more than one firm, but that's an issue, certainly with some of the smaller groups, is that, a very few dollars make the
Okay.
difference between.
so going back then to this, can you go back one slide to
Yeah.
your recommendations or considerations? So when you talk about the race, gender conscious goals, are you talking more like small disadvantaged businesses as opposed to SWAM businesses? So businesses that are considered, I guess, maybe similar to the 8A program, where they're disadvantaged based on race, gender,
Exactly.
that sort of thing? Okay.
So what it would look like, what it looks like with other organizations, a race and gender-based program is that you're looking at you're looking at certified minority and woman-owned businesses in particular. So not that different from the SWAM program, except businesses owned by non-Hispanic white men who are SWAM certified wouldn't be eligible for the race and gender conscious goals that the city might use. And I want to make a distinction because it's important that this would not be, those programs are not quota systems or set-asides for minority and women-owned businesses, both of which are legally very tricky, and in the case of quotas,
Sure.
actually aren't constitutional. But a program where you have contracting goals, or goals on individual contracts, but you have the flexibility where if prime contractors are unable to meet those goals through subcontracting commitments, they can submit good faith efforts documentation, and the city can award waivers based on a review of the efforts that they made, even if they fail to meet that goal.
Rosemary.
So beyond the considerations or drilling down through them, are you going to have some other sort of real-life suggestions of things that we can actively do to improve our numbers?
Yeah, so how would you define real life?
Well, for example, we have, with the Minority Business Council, they do work with companies to show them how to bid.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So
Or-
we'll have a number of considerations to make in terms of networking and outreach, in terms of technical assistance that the city could offer, in terms of access or loan programs that other agencies throughout the state and nationally have used with some success. So
Maybe paying quicker so that,
timeliness of payment is a big issue.
because
and one I
they
didn't-
can't float that money but so
Exactly.
long, and so have a quicker payment for their goods and services.
Yeah, and which has a disproportionate effect, again, on minority and women-owned businesses because so many of them are small businesses, and that's why timeliness of payment is so crucial to many of them. And something that came up a lot during interviews, and something that we'll talk about as part of the final report as well.
So having, I mean, that's very nice, but they're sort of high level, and it'd be
Yeah.
nice to get down to more specifics of things that we can do to,
Exactly. For the sake of today, I sort of aimed high at the high level, but in the report, there's going to be a whole collection of recommendations that range from you guys should consider race and gender conscious goals all the way down to here are some improvements you can make in data monitoring to make sure that you're monitoring information accurately and in a way that allows you to track how minority and women-owned businesses are doing over time, things like that.
And Samir, can I jump in quickly with one thing, just back to Councilman Wood's question that's important to note. As it relates to scoring sort of best faith participation, we're already in this space. Now, one place where we at the staff level within procurement, we agree that an expansion of this program is worth looking at, but just for purposes of this conversation, we actually rejected 2 bids in the last 18 months because the subcontracting participation was inadequate. So we're in this space already. It's new. It's part of your small business enhancement plan, and so we are actively scoring this in the construction space today, and particularly where federal dollars are in play. And if we don't see those best faith efforts, then we are taking action real time, and we've done that twice in the last 18 months.
John Boss.
We'll go back to the universe, because when Jim asked the question about A-Day set aside, that the federal program that they have, they validate that the controlling interest, independent of the financial equity in the country, must be held by the minority and must have all the the majority of the voting rights. When you did your universe validation on the phone books, did you validate that in fact those companies you included were in fact, in terms of the controlling interest of those firms, were in fact in minority hands?
Yeah, so the way we asked in our survey, the way we defined it was, are you a minority-owned business? And minority-owned means that it's 51% owned and operated by individuals who identify with a minority group. So that basically mimics the federal DB program.
Okay, very good.
And then we asked them their specific race, ethnicity, and then same with women. So we asked, is your firm owned, and 51% of your firm owned and controlled or operated by women? And then we did the same with vets.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right. Anybody else have any? Yes, Jessica.
I have one question about, you were talking about making sure that the awards are widely spread. Is there when we get the comprehensive data, is there a breakdown to show that, hey, there's maybe one or two businesses that seem to consume the bulk of these awards?
Yeah.
And okay.
So what we do is, group by group in our utilization analysis, we have a little, a simple metric. So we look at how many businesses for each group does it take to account for 75% of the dollars.
Okay.
By and large, the biggest issue was with Asian American owned businesses. To be frank, it was the other groups. There was a little bit more spread, and it varies from group to group. But Asian American owned businesses really stuck out at us because it's only been a couple of times in all the disparity studies that I've been involved with where there was that level of concentration for one group. And in this case, there's 85% of the dollars going to one firm. So that metric is a little funky for Asian Americans, but you kind of get the sense of how many businesses would it take to capture 75% of the dollars, and what percentage of total businesses is that?
Gotcha. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Look forward to the
It's been
final
a
report.
Well, it'd be nice, especially that we need concrete things of what we can do to improve.
Yeah, and these processes are really only as good as the clients we're working for, and I mean that. That's not just me saying that to you because I'm in front of you. It does take a lot of effort from the procurement office, and they've just been really great to us, so that's part of the reason why this project has been as successful as it has, and I think it's worth mentioning that it's a lot of burden on them, so I'm glad they put up with us.
We have great folks.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. You have any further comments? Or?
Only that if there are any further questions, of course, everyone's got my contact information. I'm happy to answer any more questions that you might have between now and the end of the process, or even after that. So please feel free to reach out to me.
When do we get the final, or when does that
So
come?
we are we're scheduled to submit a draft report here in the next few weeks, and then that's usually finalized and made public shortly thereafter.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Next item is the city manager's briefing on unaudited financial results. Patty Phillip.
Which one is this, us, I think?
Yes, sir. Mayor, members of council, Patty's here today to present to you the unaudited financial results from FY18 that closed out on 30 June. And she's been working, of course, on the CAFR, and will take a little bit longer to do that. But we always come to you and give you, when she's she's within hand grenade range, might be the right way to put it. And so she's going to give you some a feel for how we're closing out last year and moving forward.
Yeah.
Welcome, Patty.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. As Dave said, we are doing just a very short presentation on the the city's general fund and the school's general fund, the school operating fund. The idea was having this information to you sooner would be more useful to you than waiting till December when we'll report on all the city's funds. We're converting now from a budgetary basis to a full modified accrual basis, so the numbers will change around. But this year, I'm going to be asked, we have hired a new controller. You might remember the last time I was before you, Mr. Don Barnett, the city's controller, was about to retire, and we have hired Miss Alice Kelly to fill that slot, and I've asked her to walk you through these statements, the high-level statements, and I'm here in case there's any questions, I've run her through, she knows the types of questions you all like to ask, so I'm sure she'll do a great job. So Alice? And
Welcome.
Kevin is over here manning the computer.
No, actually, one person manning the computer is usually best. Thank you very much. Good evening. On August 15th of this year, the Finance Department officially closed all our books, and so we're in the process of doing all our CAFR information and getting that to our external auditors, who are Clifton, Larson, and Allen. And they're scheduled to complete the audit and give the results to council on December 11th. So on slide 3, we are going to go over the general fund budget to actual results for the fiscal year 2018. And this is on a cash basis. Our balance as of July 1st, 2017 for fund balance was $199.7 million. The actual revenue minus the general fund expenditures totals $900,000, and subtracting out the reservations, the city has an unassigned fund balance of $113.9 million. That is well within the city council policy of maintaining a general fund balance between 8 to 12% of the subsequent year's budgeted revenue. Next slide. The next slide compares general fund revenues for local type revenues. Green numbers indicate that the revenues exceed the budget. Red lines indicate that the revenue is under budget, and the blue lines are that the revenue is under budget, but the revenue exceeded last year's revenue. So real estate, which is our largest source, single source for the city of revenue, had a positive variance of $1.7 million over budget, as well as an 8.6% increase over the 2017 results. Other local revenues are over budget by $3.6 million, and some of the larger accounts in this category include permit fees, court fines, and automobile licenses. But the main driver of this increase is that the interest on our bank deposits have been much higher than our budget, and this is due to cash flows and higher interest rates. So overall, our local taxes are 0.6% over budget and 4.4% more than 2017. And our personal property tax is the main driver of the variance. So on slide 5, we have a chart of our real estate taxes history, and we're within 0.3% of our budget in FY18. The property tax rate was increased slightly in 2018, and that amount went to the schools to fund our full-day kindergarten classes. On slide 6, our personal property taxes, they came in higher than budget by $5.6 million and $8 million or 8% more than 2017. And this is one of our more volatile and harder to predict revenue streams because it's more sensitive to economic conditions and because of the asset type, and especially because of the timing of the receipt of the payments, which are typically toward the end of the fiscal year. Slide 7 is a 5-year history of other local taxes, and these have steadily increased with the exception of the telecommunication franchise fees category and cigarette taxes. On this slide, we have included all funds for the cigarette, hotel, and meal tax, and not just general fund. And below is the breakdown of each fund that these taxes are allotted to. Hotel taxes increased 4.9% from FY17, and meal tax have increased 1.6% over 2017. On slide 8, we show the general fund expenditures by category, budget to actual, and both the city and the school had a 5.1% variance positive to budget. Slide 9, The total fund balance as of June 30th is $200.6 million for general fund. Unassigned fund balance is the amount of funds remaining after all reservations are considered. City policy to have 8 to 12%, which equates to about 1 to 1.5 months of a budget. Certain items that are on the reservation list include non-spendable items such as inventories and loans receivable, and then funds remaining in the Community Services Board include restricted funds for certain programs that can only be spent on those programs, most notably permanent supportive housing program. The FY 2018 school reversion and true-up based on revenue sharing are also under reservations. City Council has already approved a slightly less than $1 million for carry-forwards. The city is planning on using $31 million for cash funding CIP for general fund and $4 million for school CIP and school operating budget. Risk management is an internal service fund that has a deficit, so it's proposed to reserve $1.8 million to alleviate a portion of that deficit. And during the FY19 budget process, $4 million was reserved to replace electronic health system in human services, and that's needed to remain certified by federal and state agencies for the Medicare and Medicaid Services Meaningful Use Program. Salary compression was reserved for $3 million to fund vertical and horizontal compression issues, and it's being proposed to reserve an additional $3.5 million for dredging equipment to more effectively navigate our channels. That is already budgeted in 2020 for $5 million, but more is needed. The next slide is a history of our unfunded or unassigned general fund balance. Our 7-year history has been between 9.5% and 10.5%, which is right within our funding policy. Slide 11 shows our schools, budget to actual for schools. As shown here, the budget reversion number is 22.9%, or $22.9 million, excuse me. In slide 12 is our summary. Our general fund balance position is well within our fund balance policy, and reservations are summarized on this slide. And our next step is we have a 5-year forecast coming up with our budget team on November 20th. Our audited financial statements will be presented to council on the December 11th, excuse me, and budget dates in March and in May are also posted. Happy to take any questions.
Anybody have any questions?
I just have one, if I could, for a later date. But on the chart, let me get through here in just a second. I don't know what slide number it is, but it's the 5-year history of other local taxes.
Sure.
You know how they often do a thing, same store sales and new store sales? If we could get this chart adjusted for what it would look like if taxes and fees were stayed the same over that whole period, so you can see how much of the revenue is attributed to tax and fee increases, so you can get that same store, new store sales picture. This is, if that's really hard, then let's not.
Okay, I'll make sure I understand the question. That's the 1% local sales tax right there.
But I thought there was a chart in here somewhere where it talked about, there's a chart like this, that talks about our revenues. So this is just a history of the 1% only. It may it's that one. Can you go back? I know it's,
For the revenues,
that's just the fund balance.
now the next,
I just want to make sure I'm answering questions.
Well, let me make sure I get a more refined question before I ask you to work on something. How's that? It struck my memory. But I did want to bring up that I have asked, we received a resolution from the schools relative to disposition reversion of their $24 million. And I mentioned it last night as well. One of those items is $6.8 million for office and administration construction on their Plaza Middle School. And I've asked for a lot of explanations. We take money from the Sandbridge TIF fund. I think it was $5 million. I think that's correct. Every year we get them plus. And I'm just asking them to explain all their capital needs. They talk about schools and bus drivers, how it is expanding an office building. Doing an administrative thing is a necessary $6.8 million when maybe they might have better uses. I think they owe us at least an explanation of how that's their highest priority out of $24 million is office space.
Dave, do you have an answer?
I know they're gonna come back and give us an answer. I'm just letting you know I posed the question. The school board is working on the answer. I'm just letting you know that I have asked it so that we can all get the same explanation, but it's coming. I just wanna make sure that you know that.
I think I sent it to you, but I'm gonna go check my email. yesterday, but I did receive it from Aaron, and I did send it before, I thought I sent it before I departed.
Share it to everyone, because I think that everyone would probably want to look at what that is. That's a big sum of money.
Can do.
Thank you very much.
All right, anybody else have any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. All right, we'll now go to city council comments. Anybody have any comments? Yes.
I do. Rosemary and I attended the Virginia Municipal League annual conference a couple of weeks ago, and I left it at home in my garage. I forgot to bring it, but I have the award that we won for platinum level for Green City, and we've gotten it, I guess, 10 years, the last 10 years. So I've got that award, and I'll bring it next week, I promise. And then we also do a Christmas tree ornament every year that we put on the tree in the governor's mansion, and I have that as well to return. It's a huge ornament, and I don't know who I need to give that to, but I do have that, and I hope that we have an even more magnificent one this year.
Well, who has delivered that in the past? Do you know?
I'm assuming Ruth, so is that right, Amanda?
No, actually, I think it's someone from the city manager's office, maybe Bob Mathias is taking it up to the governor.
I haven't, but I can.
Okay.
I mean, I'm happy to take one, I just,
I'm not sure who delivered it.
so,
It's been mailed up.
Give them gifts to the governor.
it's just ornaments for the tree, then they give them back, but,
Yeah, it's a loan. It's a loan.
so I have it to give back, I just,
Do they send it back to us every year?
apparently they do. They had it out for us to gather, so I gathered it, and I just, ran out and forgot to bring it today, so I will bring that next
This
week.
is something that's relatively new. The state hasn't been doing this very long.
Yeah,
I think this
I'd never
past
heard
year.
of it
Yeah, I think
before.
this last year was the first time they did it.
It's really kind of neat. When I was there for the holiday party last year, I looked for ours, and it was really kind of hard to miss because it was literally this tall. It's made out of wood. It was King Neptune with this big monstrosity of something all over it. And it was so big that they couldn't put it on the tree. It sat on the bottom and actually sat on the floor. So it was a very large ornament, and, with their city seal on it and that type of thing. So I don't know who made it. It was handmade, you could tell, but I don't know who did it, but.
Yeah.
Amanda does that, I think.
It's a nice idea. They ask for all the
You make
localities.
the Christmas ornaments,
put
I'm
an
pretty sure
ornament
that's
on
six
the tree.
rows.
Good idea.
It's a
Never
very
heard
nice
of it
idea.
before.
So let's have a pretty one with some crab or something on it, I don't know.
All right, anybody else with comments? Yes, John?
Just one, I know I mentioned it last week, and maybe if Andy could touch base with because I've asked myself that maybe you might be more successful since you give them money directly, but we're still looking to get Shannon and I a copy of the audit that was done for the Virginia Beach Development Corporation. I know I made reference to it relative to some of the findings, but we've yet to receive one that we've asked. And also, I would like for Patty and Company to take a look at that as well, so we maybe could sit down at some future date and we could compare notes, because as I mentioned, I have concerns relative to the deficits they're running and a fairly sizable note they have due in 2022, and I don't want to have any surprises for this body. So Shannon and I are trying to do our homework.
Sure.
We're trying.
I'm surprised you don't have it, so.
Right. City council agenda review.
Okay, under ordinances,
Excuse me, Jeff. I didn't mean to go.
There's a change to planning, item 4. Should I wait till we get to that on the review?
Yeah.
Wait till we get there.
We'll get when we get in the agenda.
all right, so under ordinances and resolutions, we have speakers on items J2 and J8C. J2 and J8C under everything. Does anybody have any concerns with any of the other ordinances or resolutions?
How are we gonna do the legislative package?
Well, that's been pulled, J2.
Oh,
All right, yes, Barbara?
I will vote no on 4. And I would just comment that the Bikes and Trails Committee had a really good briefing on the 5 issue, the bicycle and pedestrian safety program at Pacific and so forth yesterday. It was a very good presentation, and I think everybody was really concerned about the fact that it has such a large number of crashes and pedestrian problems, and so this, I think, is a certainly something that is absolutely necessary, and maybe we can continue to have some follow-up as to whether or not this is awarded and so forth.
Okay, any other comments under ordinance resolutions? Okay, under planning, K1, Kyle W. and Bailey B. Fett, variance to section 4.4B subdivision regulations, Princess Anne.
That's consent, it's a,
Okay. Number 2, Princess Anne Meadows LLC, William and James Snowden, conditional change of zoning, AG1 to R10, Princess Anne.
that's consent, it's a very minor adjustment.
But I do have a question there, and I hope in the future, because I know we talked about this on these things, that we were gonna get, obviously, someone's actually doing the stormwater management analysis. You know, we talk about the conclusion that it wasn't gonna have any impact and there was adequate capacity, but there was nothing that said what the existing capacity was, how much margin there was, how much this was consuming of that margin. There wasn't anything that, I hope in the future when we get these things, I know they're doing that work or they couldn't have drawn that conclusion, but, you know, it's always nice to see the homework, makes me smarter. So in the future, if people could, you know, share the homework, that would be great.
Item K3, Greerhahn Enterprises, Inc., Pools Dockside LLC, that's 3311 Shore Drive, Glen Haven District, I'm fine with that one. 4, Crespo Enterprises Incorporated, is this yours, Jessica? You talking
Yeah,
about?
everyone should have a copy of it. Basically, this is a existing bulk storage yard that they're trying to come into compliance. They have an existing 6-foot chain link fence, and they just want to have that, they can keep that fence until the lot behind them and to the side of them is developed residentially, and then they will come into compliance with the solid fence.
So then your consent to approve with this change to condition 1A.
Correct.
Okay, everybody okay with that? So consent change to condition 1A. Okay, number 5, Nofasat Teo and Bolud Jones Komalafe for conditional use permit regarding family daycare in Centerville.
No problem.
Okay, Mavis Bahadosing and Nicholas Grady, family daycare, Cliffwood Drive, Rose Hall.
That's fine.
Jasmine Gould, Cruise Living Trust for a conditional use permit regarding family daycare, Rose Hall.
That's fine.
Anderson's Virginia Beach LLC, AGI, VB Holdings LLC, outdoor recreational facility, 1925 Fisher Arch, Princess Anne.
That one looks good.
Mary Bozard, Thomas Lee Bozard, conditional use permit regarding residential kennel, Indian River Road, Princess Anne.
I've heard no complaints.
The Edge Sports LLC, Fairfield TIC LLC, BCP TIC LLC, DMF TIC LLC, GCK TIC LLC, for conditional use.
A lot of investors there.
These other ones are harder. For conditional use permit, indoor recreational facility, Fairfield Shopping Center, Kempsville.
Yeah, that one's fine.
Ordinance to adopt and incorporate into the Virginia Beach Comprehensive Plans, Burton Station Strategic Growth Area, Master Plan 2018, and was something at our place about that. And that's in the Bayside District, Mr. Mayor.
So what you have here, I have Mark Shea here. Mark, would you please, with the permission of the council, can he explain what he put in front of you today so that we can fully understand the executive summary that makes the corrections from the existing comp plan to the rework of the Burton Station comp plan that has all the proper inserts associated with it?
This document that was presented in your package on Friday is the policy changes. And what I gave you today was the cleanup from the existing comp plan where the text from the 2016 plan has been changed because of this. And so then we will just make those changes to the existing comp plan.
Does the Norfolk Airport Authority have the authority to rezone their own property?
No, sir. You actually, as a council, the property owned by the airport authority inside the City of Virginia Beach, the rezoning that took place associated with the Burton Station was to rezone their residential to light industrial, and all those actions took place with your authority.
The only reason I ask is this thing says third, the Norfolk Airport Authority rezoned 36 acres of land from residential to industrial. I just was reading what's in here.
That is incorrectly stated, but I will restate for the record and that you all approved all zoning actions associated with all property ownership in the city of Virginia.
We did that about a year ago.
I know we did, I was just mentioning I do
Right,
read what's in front of me.
we will make that correction.
It said had rezoned.
All right,
This unit has obtained rezoning from the city council for
Whatever, you just, I just
Check.
read what you put in front of me.
so now we will go into the informal session, and I will read the motion. The chair will entertain a motion to recess into a closed session pursuant to the exemption for open meetings allowed by section 2.2-3711A Code of Virginia as amended for the following purposes: legal matters, consultation with legal counsel, and briefings by staff members or consultants pertaining to actual or probable litigation where such consultation or briefing an open meeting would adversely affect the negotiating or litigating posture of the public body, and consultation with legal counsel employed or retained by a public body regarding specific legal matters requiring the provision of legal advice by such counsel pursuant to section 2.2-3711A 7. Greg Vogel versus City of Virginia Beach, and M.Y. Alexis 7/28/18 grounding in Rudy Inlet. Public contract, discussion of the award of a public contract involving the expenditure of public funds and discussion of the terms or scope of such contract where discussion in an open session would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body pursuant to section 2.2-3711A 29 Norfolk Water Contract. Personnel matters, discussion, consideration, or interviews of prospective candidates for employment, assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, salaries, disciplining, or resignation of specific public officers, appointees, or employees of any public body pursuant to section 2.2-3711A1, council appointments, council boards, commissions, committees, authorities, agencies, and appointees. May I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Madam Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Henley?
Aye.
Mr. Dyer?
Aye.
Mr. Moss?
Aye.
Mr. Davenport?
Aye.
Ms. Abbott?
Aye.
Ms. Kane?
Aye.
Mr. Orange?
Aye.
Ms. Wilson?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Wood?
Aye.
Ayes have it.
Aye.